Hi there, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Mia and I am the maker behind KnitandGrace. And so today I want to bring you a video that I've kind of been thinking about for quite some time. And if you watch my monthly podcasts, you all know that I do a lot of test knitting. So I wanted to sort of film a video on test knitting in general, in terms of what it is, what you need to do to get into it, etc. And then I decided that since I recently signed up for a test knit, that I would sort of document the process journal style for you all, and sort of sit and knit and chat with you for a little bit of the video. So you will have already seen footage of sort of the starting process of the making of the Miles tee by Ozetta, and the designer behind Ozetta is Haley Smedley. And yeah, this is a test knit that I was super excited for. I'd been following the Miles shirt jacket that she put out a couple months ago, and when I saw that she was working on a tee version, I was really excited for it, especially because I had yarn in stash, which doesn't usually happen, that I thought would be perfect for this tee. And so I was like, well, this would be a perfect opportunity if I was picked to do this test knit. I could get rid of some stash yarn and then also, take part in a really fun test knit. So to tell you a little bit about the tee itself, it is a drop shoulder tee with eyelet detail across the back increases. So it's a very traditional drop shoulder design where you knit the back panel, you pick up the shoulders and knit the shoulders, and then join for the front, and then join the body in the round and knit the rest of the body. So it's a very traditional drop shoulder construction, but it gives it this nice little detail of having those eyelets across the back. So that is what I'm working on today. If you want to grab your knitting, let me know what you're knitting on today. And I'm actually at the point where I just finished my first ball of yarn, and I'm adding the next one, so I thought that it would be perfect to sort of mark the progress with regard to how far we get in our knitting. Of course, I'm on a purl row, so we'll see how that goes, but to show you what I have so far, this is the back of the tee, and so we have the eyelets across the back. I've just picked up the shoulders, and I've just joined the left and front fronts just a couple rows ago. And I just realized I didn't turn off my air purifier for this, so just let me do that now. Hopefully the beginning of the video wasn't too loud. So I have joined the front. I have quite a bit of stockinette back and forth to knit, so I figured this is a good place to stop, do this little knit and chat, and then I will journal the rest of the process throughout the rest of the video, and then also give you my final thoughts on the tee itself at the end of the video. So I'll give you a little bit of detail about the pattern, the yarn I'm using, my process, and then I'm probably going to put this out when the pattern goes live, so you'll also be able to purchase the pattern if it is one you're interested in. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with joining my yarn. This is a center pull skein, which is great. Oh, there are some ends here. I always like to just tuck those in. So to tell you a little bit more about this pattern, as I mentioned, It is a drop shoulder tee, so it's a summer pattern. I chose a yarn that I have worked with before, and I had it in my stash, and I actually had it in my stash. I think I've spoken actually a couple times about this. I bought Barocco Remix Light, and so, you know, Barocco is a larger yarn retailer. They're kind of, you know, what you would think of commercial yarn, but they have this wonderful line of recycled yarns called Remix. And so there's Remix, which is their worsted version, and there's Remix Light, which is labeled as a DK. But I have actually knit, this is my second fingering weight project that I've knit with this yarn. And so I think that it's a very, very light DK, heavy fingering is the way that I would describe it. And so yeah, so you can definitely knit it, use it for those fingering weight projects that have a looser gauge, or a DK weight project that has a tighter gauge. One thing that I will let you know about this yarn is if you are not someone who washes their swatches, you might be in for a little surprise if you don't do that with this yarn. This yarn actually blooms quite a bit, so it does grow. The content is cotton, linen, and viscose, I believe. I'll, you know, insert the details to the yarn below, but you know, it is a recycled yarn. The cool thing about it is not only is it a recycled yarn, but it's actually not dyed. So the colors that come out, or the colors that they create, are actually just made from the fabric and millings that they use to create the yarn. So the yarn is not only recycled, but it's also not dyed, so it's not, you know, creating any new water pollution or anything like that. So I thought that was a really cool concept. But getting back to blocking your swatch, if you're not someone who blocks your swatch, you definitely want to do so with this yarn because it does grow quite a bit. So I've always noticed that my stitch count is usually off at least by 1 stitch, sometimes 1.5, sometimes 2, once I block it. So definitely make sure to take measurements of your swatch pre and post washing so that you can figure out what the best gauge is for you. So that's a little bit about the yarn, a little bit about the pattern itself. I'm making the 6th size, which is a 50.5, so 50.5 inch finished bust. And my bust is anywhere between 44 and 46 inches, depending on my undergarments that I wear. So a bit of positive ease, and yeah, I mean, this is my 3rd time working with this yarn. I love this yarn. I love the concept of the yarn, and it's just a very easy yarn to wear. It is machine washable, although I've not machine washed anything. I don't machine wash any of my knits really, but it is machine washable if that is something you're interested in. And yeah, I think the pattern is originally designed for wool dreamers. So that is one thing that you want to keep in mind if you are testing a pattern. You always want to pick a yarn that has a similar weight to the yarn that is being used in the pattern. So, and what I mean by that is your yards to grams. So a lot of the times it's not only about, is a yarn labeled the correct weight, so a fingering or DK or worsted, it's also about the weight, because while there are some standards in terms of, you know, the yardage per grams or the meterage per grams, it will vary slightly depending on the yarn. So that is something that you want to consider whenever you are choosing yarn substitutions, not only for patterns that you're testing, but just for patterns that you're knitting in general. So yeah, I don't think that I've really figured out how I'm going to mark my progress here. I'm just going to keep talking and we'll figure out how much progress I make. But the way that I've sort of set this up is I have three sort of areas to cover with regard to test knitting. So first is what is test knitting. Second is how to know if test knitting is something for you. And then the last part will be where to actually find, test knit calls. So opportunities to test knit. So getting right into what is test knitting. So test knitting is a process by which a designer requests feedback on a pattern that is going to be released in the future. And so depending on the designer, you usually will receive the pattern for free. I've never signed up for a test knit that I have to pay for the pattern. I don't know if that's even a thing. I do know that some designers, if you do not finish the test on time, will submit an invoice for you to pay for the pattern, which if that's, that's perfectly okay. If that's, if you don't fulfill the duties of being a test knitter. But in terms of the test knit itself, you shouldn't have to pay for the test knit. And again, it's just a designer is looking to release a pattern either in the near or far future, and they want to gather feedback. So test knitting is a job. It's not just like getting a free pattern. So that is a common misconception. It is something to be taken very seriously. And with regard to what you're doing is, you're really helping the designer, especially if a pattern has not been tech edited, you're helping them find mistakes, making sure the math is okay, making sure the instructions read well. So if there are any confusing parts, a designer might clarify the instructions or even film a video for that part of the pattern to make sure that design or knitters, once the design goes live, are able to knit the pattern successfully. You can also suggest other improvements on the pattern. So for instance, I am a larger bodied person, so especially when you're looking at a size inclusive pattern that's being knit, from all the way from a 32-inch bust to like a 60-inch bust, that's a very wide range of bodies, and bodies are shaped differently. So a lot of the times there are modifications that are needed to be done for larger bodies that maybe don't need to be done for smaller bodies. So things like that, suggestions on fit, like, sometimes I've knit a design where like, oh, the armhole shaping is too tight. And so, then you go back to the designer and you let them know like, oh, based on the number of stitches you're asking me to pick up, the armhole was too tight. Might this be a better way to pick up stitches? So it's very much a collaborative process. And then usually you're also included in a chat of some sort, whether it's like via Slack or Instagram chats, where you can interact with the other testers. And that also helps with fixing mistakes as well, and like, spotting mistakes, or if you spot something before someone else does, then they don't have to, rip back or anything like that. And it also is just a very collaborative process. I find that it's very like, it's very fun. You get to know the people that you're testing with. People share their progress photos, and some of the tests I've been involved in have been with people all over the world. So just as I'm waking up, there are people who are going to sleep who have been testing all night long. So it's a really fun process that way. In terms of other feedback that you're going to provide the designer, you're going to provide the designer feedback on your gauge, on your yardage, and on different yarns that you use. If you use a yarn that is different from the one that the pattern calls for. And then lastly, probably the biggest advantage to a designer outside of, just the feedback and helping to make sure that the pattern is published or polished once it's published is there is, the marketing aspect to it. So a lot of the times, it's not required by any means by most designers, but a lot of times you'll post to Instagram or your social media about the pattern that you're working on. So it builds up hype for the pattern. Also, it's nice once the pattern is released that they have a bunch of different finished samples of the pattern, and so those are all shared usually by Ravelry, or if the designer puts out a blog post in conjunction with the pattern, etc. And so it helps not only so that people can see what the design looks like on bodies other than the designer's body, but also, especially for someone like me who is a larger bodied person, if I'm looking at a pattern, I want to look at what it looks like on a larger bodied person. So, that's kind of the test knitting process, or what it is and why designers put out test knitting calls. So with regard to how to know if test knitting is right for you and if it is something that you're interested in, first and foremost, you need to be able to stick to a deadline. So if you are not someone who is a deadline-driven knitter, test knitting is probably not for you. Although I will say there are some designers that put out like pre-knits, so they just want people to start knitting the pattern after the pattern's already been tech edited and all of that, and they don't expect any mistakes with the pattern. So there are some things like that where it's like a pre-knit where there's like an implicit deadline, but you don't have to necessarily stick to it. Or there are some designers that have more loose deadlines. So for instance, I've test knit for Jacqueline Cieslak before, and one of my tests I was able to finish on deadline and the other one I wasn't, and she's not like a designer that penalizes anyone for not finishing a test knit on time. I did ultimately finish the second test that I did for her, although it was a little bit later. But most of the time, outside of any type of situations that might come up, obviously most designers are going to be very understanding of that. You want to be able to stick to a deadline. Okay, so now let's say that that you can stick to a deadline. Another quality that you want to have is someone who follows instructions really well. I think that this kind of, obviously you want to be able to follow the instructions so that you can knit the final product. But especially when it comes to test knitting, a lot of the times a designer does not want you to alter the pattern in any way when you're knitting it. And that's something to keep in mind. So if you're someone who kind of likes to buy a pattern and you kind of just make it your own, and you do whatever it is that you think you want to do, for whatever reason you go off gauge, or you change the instructions up slightly or anything like that, that's usually not what you want to be doing when you're test knitting. Usually the expectation is that you're going to follow the instructions. A lot of the times there are things like shortening and lengthening a pattern that the designer is perfectly okay with, especially when it comes to height differences. But other than that, most designers do not want you to make any major changes to the pattern when you're test knitting it. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, having an eye for detail. If a pattern hasn't been tech edited, and sometimes even if it has been tech edited, you want to be able to spot minor mistakes. And this is something that sometimes is not super like in your face, because especially if it's like a super minor mistake, let's say like the designer says you want to, row 1 is purl and row 2 is knit, and those are the next rows that are corresponding to your pattern, but then you don't realize that the purl row which is really the wrong side row, is actually labeled as the right side row. So it could be something like that. That's super, super minor, that, you know, when you're looking at the pattern just at first glance, you're like, okay, yep, I'm purling my next round or row, and I'm knitting the row after that. That coincides with where I am in the pattern. But if you're not looking at the super, like every single letter and every single word in the pattern, that's something that you might not catch. So having that attention to detail is really important. Also, not being afraid to reknit. There have been some test knits that, you know, as you're going through them, either the gauge is not working or the shaping's not working, and then as the designer is making edits to the final pattern, you have to be unafraid to rip back and reknit that process. Right now, actually, I am test knitting some socks that I have now had to rip back 2 times. So this is my third time knitting up the socks because we've been experiencing some gauge issues. So, you know, that's something that you need to be unafraid of ripping back a project if something's not working and, you know, the designer changes it up in a major way. And then last and not least, you know, sort of kind of coming to that free marketing piece of it all is being able to take great finished object photos. So whether it's, some designers will require that you take a certain number. Most will ask that you are wearing the pattern itself, again, so that people can see what it looks like on. You're not necessarily obligated to show your face, but they do want to see it on a body. And what I like to do when I take my finished objects photos and I post my project to Ravelry is I like to write test in the description of the pattern. So like whatever I'm naming my pattern, I'll usually have a little like test description there. And that's also so that people know that I test this pattern. But also, it helps if you are signing up for future testing calls, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about too. It helps designers to see the projects that you've test knitted in the past. And then a few other things that kind of just should be pretty, you know, common sense is having good communication skills. You need to be able to communicate with the designer as well as with other testers to make sure that the, you know, test is successful. And then also, you know, first and foremost, when you first sign up for a test knit, you need to understand the skills that the pattern calls for and make sure that you are able to complete the pattern. And some designers will say like, hey, this is an intermediate pattern, it uses these techniques, and sometimes they will say we would like a mix of people who either know these techniques and people who don't know these techniques, especially if it's a designer who's really looking to make sure that the pattern is super clear. They may decide to pick testers that have never knit that technique before, so that they can make sure that their instructions are very clear. So, you know, just kind of like the same way that you would make sure that you understand the techniques in a pattern that you're purchasing to knit up, you should also understand the techniques that a pattern you're applying to test calls for so that you can complete the pattern. So I'm whizzing along here. I'm not sure how long we have been going because my camera battery died and I had to restart, and I just had a mild freak out moment and I thought that I wasn't recording. But yeah, so moving along to the last piece of the testing information that I want to give you today is, and sorry, I'm pulling from the center, so sometimes the yarn can get a little sticky, is where to actually find test calls. So a test call is usually, you know, how a designer will put out they're looking for people to test a pattern. Sometimes you can join Ravelry forums for the different designers if Ravelry is accessible to you. So designers will have Ravelry forums, and some designers exclusively find their testers on Ravelry, which I don't use Ravelry forums, so I really don't sign up for a test through Ravelry forum. If it's a matter of, a designer puts out a test call in another media that I use, and then they say, hey, go to Ravelry and apply for it, then I'll do that. But in terms of, searching forums, that's personally not how I do it. But if you're someone who, enjoys Ravelry forums, you can definitely follow designers, and a lot of designers will put out tests that way. Also, like, there are designer groups that you can join, and designers will put out test calls that way, especially when it comes to like the knitting publications as well. There are usually like newsletters that you can sign up for, either through designers or through the different publications, to be a tester. So that's one of the ways, as well as mailing lists. A lot of designers will have tester exclusive mailing lists, so that you're not necessarily subscribing to the designer's regular newsletter. This is a completely different newsletter that's only for testers and for testing calls. Also, following the Instagram hashtag test knitters needed is a good one, and that's how I found a lot of tests in the beginning. And that's actually how I found a lot of designers that I ended up liking also. But also just following the designers that you like on Instagram. So same as following them on Ravelry, you want to follow them on Instagram. A lot of them will put out tester calls, and then even as they design patterns and they put out sneak peeks of the patterns, if something appeals to you, you're like, oh, that's a future design, I would definitely want to test knit that, then you can figure out in advance of the test knit call even being put out how that designer typically does their test knit calls, and then, make sure that you're keeping an eye out for that medium if you want to, sign up to be a tester. And then another place that I know that I have found test knits, and either through the site itself or through a designer who posts a test knit call on Instagram and then uses this platform to host their test knits. It's a site called Yarn Pond. And so this site, you can sign up for not only test knits, but if you're a sample knitter, you can sign up to knit samples on there as well. And so it's a pretty cool site, sort of bringing designers and knitters together for their different needs. And then sort of like a bonus way that I have found to test is if you're a Patreon supporter of a designer or a yarn that you like or anything like that, a lot of the times there will be like exclusive test calls, or they'll give first dibs to people in those groups. So for instance, I'm a Patreon supporter of Owner Akier, and Caroline puts out a lot of test knit calls on behalf of designers, and so that's actually how I was able to get first dibs at the Fields of Gold sweater design. And then Bella, once she sort of found her test knitters in that group, she put out a public testing call to fill the other sizes that she hadn't filled from the Patreon group. So a lot of the times it's not even like that's the only way that the designer will put out a call, but they'll give those folks sort of first dibs. And that's why sometimes even when you see a designer will put out a testing call, some of their design, like some of the sizes have already been filled, and that's usually why, because they usually give sort of that first pass at a particular group of folks, and then from there they will publish it to the general public. And I know I believe Melody of Bee Mandarines, she does this as well. I'm a Patreon supporter of her, but with her too, she actually does it even completely different, where she just releases the beta tech edited version to the untech edited version to anyone who's a Patreon supporter. And then a lot of people will start knitting it while it's in the tech editing process. And then she puts out, public testing calls, and then people can test her pattern. So that's another way, if you are a supporter of a particular designer or a yarn company, that's another way to find test opportunities. So I think that's about all I had to talk about the testing process itself. I got pretty good amount, like I got maybe like an inch done. It's back and forth knitting and purling, so I'm not as fast. So let's see. So I got about an inch and a half done from here to the needle. So not too bad. So yeah, so I'm going to continue working on this. I'm going to continue to film footage as I work on this sweet little tee, and then I will check back in with you all once I finish the tee with a final fit of the tee. So I'll film a little video of me wearing it, and I'll also let you know my final thoughts on the pattern. Okay, so here it is, my finished Miles tee. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love it. I really don't have anything but great words to say about the testing process, the project itself. It was a very smooth process. So taking you through how Haley ran the test, she essentially shared the PDF with everyone. And there was an Instagram group where everyone could chat about their yarn choices, if any issues came up, any questions, concerns, things like that. and it was a pretty smooth process overall. The sweater had been completely tech edited, so I think that there was like one very minor error that we caught in the group, but other than that, everything was smooth sailing. In terms of my top, I made the 6th size, which is the 50.5-inch bust. And for reference, I have a 44 to 46-inch bust, depending on my undergarments. So, you know, about 4 to 6 inches of positive ease, which is what I believe the pattern calls for. And yeah, I just love it. I was able to get gauge on the recommended needle size, which is a US 4, or I think that's 3.25. Let me look at my notes here. A 3.5 millimeter needle, and that was in the round. So because I'm a loose purler and I know that, I just, on my own, I didn't even have to do a second gauge swatch. I just, whenever I was knitting flat, I used size 3 needles, which is 3.25 millimeter needles. And then whenever I was knitting in the round, I used size 4. And because I used a yarn that is mainly cotton based, so I use Barocco Remix Light, if I haven't mentioned that already. I actually went further down on my ribbing needle. So the pattern calls for US 4 as your main needle and US 3 as your ribbing needle. So I actually went down to a 2.5 or a 3 millimeter needle for my ribbing, just because I wanted to make sure that my ribbing was nice and tight, since I was using a cotton yarn, and the yarn that she used for the sample is a merino wool, so that is always going to have a lot more springiness, a lot more memory than a cotton yarn. So I did go down even further for my ribbing. So a super crazy combo of needles used there, but I will link to my Ravelry project page as well as the pattern page below, so you could take a look at that. With regard to the gauge, my row gauge was also very, very slightly off, to the point where after I did the increases for the back, what I did was she lets you know, like, okay, after you do the increases, knit straight for a couple, you know, a certain number of rows. And so what I did was, I think I ended up like 4 rows shorter in each section that she called for. So I just made sure that I always measured along the way when it came to any parts where she actually indicated how many rows or rounds you should knit for. I always just made sure that my gauge, because my row gauge was slightly bigger, that I accommodated for that. So I knit to length in those sections, but I don't really think that really took away from much of regard to the yardage or anything like that. And the fit is perfectly fine, because it was actually, I think this is like the first time that I blocked a garment and it blocked exactly to size without me having to manipulate it in any way. So it was really, really well written. The measurements were really well done. And yeah, what else can I tell you about this? It was, again, a really seamless process. I'll link to my Ravelry pages down below. I feel like I had something else to say and I completely forgot what I was going to say. But I guess I will end this video here. I hoped that you enjoyed this journal style type of video, and I'm hoping to maybe do a few more in the future on different topics depending on what I'm knitting on. And if you did like this type of video, please let me know. If you have any questions about you know, my testing experiences or anything like that, definitely leave them in the comments down below. Any other questions at all, always just feel free to drop me a line in the comments down below. And do all the things, you know, like, subscribe, hit the bell if you like these videos. I'm very close to 1,000 subscribers here and 1,000 followers on Instagram. So I'm planning a little something for when I hit that. It would be nice if I hit those numbers in September, being that, you know, this is a year since I started my channel, but I don't think that it's gonna be possible by the end of September. But definitely, if you like my content, make sure you subscribe. It helps me, and then you get to see my videos on a regular basis when I upload them. So I will leave you here. I hope that you are enjoying your weekend, or have enjoyed your weekend depending on when you're seeing this. And I will see you in my next podcast episode coming up in 1 week. See you next time. Bye.